The grand ballroom of the Vance estate shimmered under the weight of 1,000 crystal teardrops hanging from the chandeliers, each one catching the light and throwing it back against the polished marble floors in a dizzying kaleidoscope of manufactured stars. The air itself was thick, not just with the cloying sweetness of imported orchids arranged in towering ice sculptures, but with the dense, performative sympathy that radiated from the city's elite as they clustered around the evening's tragic centerpiece. Elara Vance, daughter of the billionaire whose name was stamped on the very building they stood in, sat perfectly still upon a velvet-upholstered chair that looked more like a throne for a forgotten queen. Dressed in a gown of pristine white silk, her hands lay folded in her lap, pale and unmoving as alabaster sculptures. Her face, a mask of ethereal beauty, was turned towards a middle distance only she could perceive, her famous sapphire eyes open but utterly vacant, seeing nothing. She was the portrait of a broken angel, and the crowd adored the narrative. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vance, stood flanking her like polished, grieving sentinels. A reporter, his voice a hushed, respectful murmur, asked about the foundation they'd started in Elara's name, the one funding research for traumatic optical injuries. Mrs. Vance, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears placed there by a masterful makeup artist, spoke of the accident years ago, the fall from the grand staircase that had stolen the light from their daughter's world. She spoke of their endless hope, their unwavering dedication to finding a cure, her voice breaking at precisely the right moment to elicit a wave of admiring sighs from the attendees. Mr. Vance placed a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder, his jaw set in a look of stoic, paternal strength, accepting the silent accolades of the room for bearing such a burden with such grace. They were the perfect picture of tragic wealth, noble in their suffering. And moving through this scene, a silent, dark-skinned ghost in a stiff black and white uniform, was Maya. She navigated the periphery of the glittering crowd, her tray of champagne flutes held steady, her eyes downcast. She was part of the scenery, as invisible and expected as the potted ferns. A guest would take a glass without a word, without a glance, their attention firmly fixed on the dramatic tableau of the Vances. Maya's shoulders ached from the strain of holding the tray aloft for hours, but the physical discomfort was a dull throb compared to the quiet humiliation of her erasure. She was the machinery that made this beautiful life run smoothly, machinery that was meant to be neither seen nor heard. She overheard snippets of conversation, praises for the Vances' strength, their compassion, their resilience. The words felt heavy and false in the air. The next morning, the mansion was steeped in the expensive silence that follows great noise. Sunlight streamed through the spotless windows of Elara's bedroom, a room larger than Maya's entire apartment. It was a museum to a life not fully lived, filled with beautiful, untouched things. Elara was seated at her vanity, her back to Maya, who was meticulously dusting the countless glass figurines on a shelf. The only sound was the soft whisper of the cloth and the faint, rhythmic tapping of Elara's fingers on the vanity's surface. She offered no greeting, no acknowledgement of Maya's presence. To Elara, the maid was no more a person than the vacuum cleaner that hummed in the halls on Tuesdays. The door opened and Mrs. Vance swept in, a vision in a silk robe. She smiled brightly at her daughter's reflection in the mirror. "Good morning, my darling. Did you sleep well?" She didn't wait for an answer, her gaze flicking over to Maya. "Oh, good you're here. I want you to be especially thorough with the dusting today. Elara's senses are so heightened now, she'll know if there's a single speck out of place. We must be so careful with her health." She spoke about Maya to Elara as if she were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. Maya kept her eyes on her work, her cheeks burning with a familiar, shameful heat. She was an object of concern, a potential vector of dust that might inconvenience the precious, blind daughter. Elara gave a slight, regal nod, accepting her mother's concern as her due, never once turning to look at the maid being discussed. Later, Maya was on her knees, polishing the rich, dark wood of the floor around Elara's desk. Elara had moved to sit there, her posture ramrod straight, one hand resting near a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen that lay on the blotter. Maya shifted her weight, and her elbow accidentally brushed against the leg of the desk. The pen wobbled, tipped, and began its fall toward the hard floor. It happened in a heartbeat. A blur of motion. Elara's hand snapped out with a speed and precision that was breathtaking, her fingers closing around the pen an inch from the ground. It was a flawless, instinctive catch. For a single, earth-shattering second, Maya's eyes met Elara's. The vacancy was gone, replaced by a flash of sharp, clear, panicked awareness. The connection lasted less than a moment before the veil dropped back down. Elara's face went slack. She let the pen fall from her fingers to clatter harmlessly against the toe of her shoe. She frowned, a look of mild confusion on her face. "Maid," she said, her voice cold and devoid of the panic Maya had just seen in her eyes. "Be more careful. I may not see you, but I know when you are clumsy." The reprimand was delivered with icy calm. Maya could only mutter a quiet, "Yes, Miss Elara," her heart hammering against her ribs. The moment replayed in her mind over and over. The speed, the accuracy, the direct eye contact. It was not the action of a blind person. It was a slip, a tiny crack in a perfectly constructed wall, and Maya had been the only witness. From that day forward, Maya's world shifted. The humiliations, the invisibility, they faded into background noise, replaced by a new, singular focus. Her eyes, trained by a life of service to notice details others missed, became forensic tools. She watched Elara with an intensity that was almost predatory. She saw how the girl never once stumbled over a throw rug that had been slightly askew. She noticed that when a new vase was placed on a console table, Elara's hand, which usually drifted through the air with theatrical uncertainty, would somehow avoid it completely. She saw the way Elara would fumble for a book, her hand landing directly on the correct one without a single searching pat. The evidence was in the negative space, in the things that did not happen. The grand performance of blindness was flawless for an audience that wanted to believe it, but to Maya, who was truly unseen, the cracks were beginning to show everywhere, a web of tiny, invisible fractures waiting for the right pressure to shatter completely. The obedient maid was gone, replaced by a silent investigator, gathering proof of a lie that everyone else, in their willingness to believe a beautiful tragedy, was desperate to ignore. The days following the incident with the pen settled into a new and tense rhythm within the cavernous silence of the Vance mansion. Maya moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency as always, but her mind was no longer on the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams or the precise alignment of the silverware. It was a trap, a hunter's mind meticulously observing the patterns of its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to spring. Elara, for her part, seemed to have doubled down on her performance, her movements becoming even more deliberately hesitant, her vacant gaze more fixed than ever, as if she could feel the weight of Maya's scrutiny and was determined to prove it wrong. The air between them, in the rooms they shared, grew thick with unspoken challenge. Maya decided the observation needed to become action. She needed a test, something simple, something undeniable, something that could not be explained away by heightened senses or miraculous coincidence. The opportunity presented itself in the sunroom, a glass-walled enclosure filled with lush, green plants and wicker furniture. It was Elara's favorite place to take her morning tea, a ritual performed with theatrical care. Today Maya was tasked with setting the tray. Her hands were steady as she placed the fine china pot, the delicate cup, the small jug of milk. Her heart, however, was a frantic drum against her ribs. As she set the cup and saucer down on the small table beside Elara's usual chair, she deliberately, and with calculated precision, placed it so that the very edge of the saucer hung off the table by a good inch. It was a precarious, unstable position. It would take only the slightest brush, the smallest vibration, to send it tumbling to the tile floor below. She finished the arrangement and retreated to a corner, pretending to polish a large leaf on a fiddle-leaf fig tree, her body half turned away but her eyes locked on the doorway. Minutes later, Elara entered, guided as always by her mother's hand on her elbow. Mrs. Vance settled her into the chair. "Your tea is right beside you, darling," she said, her voice syrupy with care. "Right on the table. Can you smell the bergamot?" Elara offered a faint, grateful smile, her face turned towards the steaming pot. The moment her mother's footsteps faded down the hall, the performance began. Elara's hand lifted, her fingers fluttering in the air with practiced uncertainty, moving in a wide, searching arc that should, by all accounts, have swept the cup and saucer into a catastrophic crash onto the floor. But it didn't. Her hand moved in that wide arc, but it dipped under the table's edge, avoiding the space where the tray was completely, before rising up and then descending with unerring accuracy directly onto the handle of the teacup. Her fingers closed around it perfectly. There was no fumble, no tentative tap against the china. It was a direct, confident, visual acquisition. She lifted the cup, brought it to her lips, and took a sip, her expression one of serene enjoyment, utterly unaware that Maya had just witnessed the complete demolition of her carefully constructed world. Maya felt a cold certainty wash over her, colder than the water in her polishing bucket. The doubt was gone, replaced by a solid, immovable truth. She waited until Elara had set the cup down again. The silence of the sunroom was deafening, broken only by the distant chirp of a bird outside. Maya took a step forward, her voice, when it came, was low but clear, cutting through the humid air like a knife. "Miss Elara," she said. The use of her name, direct and unadorned by any title of deference, made Elara start slightly. "I know you can see." The words hung there, simple and devastating. Elara's body went rigid. The serene mask cracked, and for a terrifying second, raw fear flashed in her eyes before it was smothered by a wave of indignant fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper, all pretense of vague sweetness gone. "How dare you speak to me that way? You're a servant. A nothing. You're imagining things. My hearing is very acute, that's all. I will have you fired for this insolence. My parents will hear of this immediately." She began to rise, her movements suddenly sharp and angry, no longer the slow, careful motions of a blind woman. But Maya didn't flinch. The threat of being fired, which would have once filled her with dread, now seemed trivial against the magnitude of the lie. "Your hearing told you the cup was hanging off the table?" Maya asked, her voice still calm. "Your hearing told you exactly where the handle was? I have been watching you, Miss Elara. You never bump into the furniture that gets moved. You only drop things when you know someone is looking. You caught that pen. I saw you." She listed the evidence, each point a hammer blow against Elara's crumbling facade. Elara's face paled, then flushed with anger and panic. Without another word, she turned and fled the sunroom, her footsteps swift and sure on the tile floor, heading straight for the main wing of the house, for the security of her parents. Maya stood alone in the sunroom, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. Mr. and Mrs. Vance would descend upon her, enraged, and she would be thrown out without a reference, her word worth nothing against theirs. But she couldn't leave without being sure. She had to know why. She moved quickly, her cleaning forgotten. She went straight to Elara's bedroom, the inner sanctum. This was a gross violation, a fireable offense 1,000 times over, but the line had already been crossed. She started searching, her hands trembling but her purpose firm. She looked in drawers, under the mattress, behind the rows of untouched books on the shelves. And then she found it. Tucked away at the back of her closet, hidden inside a hollowed-out classic novel, was a simple leather-bound journal. She opened it. Elara's elegant script filled the pages. And with every word Maya read, the terrible, pathetic truth unfolded. The sight had returned, not gradually, but in a sudden, glorious flood after a secret experimental surgery in Switzerland 2 years ago, a surgery her parents had arranged and then sworn everyone to secrecy about. The diary entries were a torrent of conflicting emotions. The joy of seeing colors again, the sunlight, her own face, followed by the crushing weight of the lie. Her parents had insisted. The public sympathy was a goldmine for their business, they said. The tragic blind daughter narrative was priceless PR. And more than that, it was a means of control. As long as the world believed Elara was broken, they could keep her sheltered, dependent, a beautiful doll in a gilded cage, never able to truly leave them or defy them. Elara's writings were filled with loneliness, with guilt at the deception, with fury at her prison, but always the entries ended with a chilling resignation. She was too afraid of her parents' wrath, too accustomed to the luxury, to ever expose the secret herself. The door to the bedroom burst open. Mr. and Mrs. Vance stood there, their faces contorted with fury. A hulking security guard stood behind them. "How dare you?" Mr. Vance roared. "Get away from my daughter's things. You're finished? You will be removed from this property immediately." Mrs. Vance pointed a trembling finger. "How dare you upset Elara with your ridiculous accusations?" They expected her to cower, to beg, to be dragged out weeping. Maya slowly closed the diary. She turned to face them, and the calmness on her face gave them pause. She held up the leather-bound book. "My accusations are not ridiculous," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound authority. "They're all in here. The surgery in Switzerland. The returned sight. The PR strategy. The control." The color drained from the Vances faces. The bluster vanished, replaced by sheer, undiluted terror. They were caught. The truth was no longer a secret whispered behind closed doors. It was physical, tangible, held in the hands of the maid they had considered beneath their notice. Maya looked from one stunned face to the other. "I am leaving now," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And I am taking this with me. You have one choice. You tell everyone the truth yourselves today, or I will take it directly to the press." She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply stated a fact. The terrible secret was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to her now. And in that moment, the balance of power in the room, in the entire mansion, shifted irrevocably. The hunter had not only caught her prey, she had discovered the rotten heart of the entire forest, the silence that followed Maya's pronouncement was more profound than any noise the grand mansion had ever contained. It was the silence of a worldview shattering, of an empire built on a single delicate lie crumbling into dust. Mr. Vance's face, usually a mask of arrogant command, had gone a sickly gray. Mrs. Vance's hand fluttered to her throat, her eyes wide with a terror far deeper than any she had ever feigned for her daughter. They were utterly paralyzed, watching the young woman they had paid to clean their floors now hold the entirety of their lives, their reputation, their fortune in her hands. Maya did not wait for their response. With a dignity that seemed to radiate from her, she walked calmly past the stunned security guard, down the grand staircase, and out the heavy front door, the diary held firmly at her side. The bright sunlight of the outside world felt like a baptism. The following days were a storm of public humiliation, a spectacle played out across news channels and social media. Forced by the threat of Maya's evidence, the Vances held a press conference. They stood behind a bank of microphones, but the polished, powerful figures from the charity gala were gone, replaced by two shrunken, pale imitations. Their statements were halting, riddled with half-truths and minimized details, but the core admission was there. Elara could see. She had been able to see for years. The public's adoration curdled into outrage overnight. The narrative of the tragic, noble family was ripped away to reveal something ugly and manipulative. Business partners dissolved alliances, citing a catastrophic breach of trust. The stock of Vance Holdings plummeted. The very sympathy they had mined for profit now turned against them with a vicious force, a tidal wave of scorn and ridicule that washed away the foundations of their social standing. They became a global laughingstock, a cautionary tale of wealth without wisdom. Inside the mansion, which now felt less like a home and more like a gilded prison, the aftermath was even more desolate. The expensive silence was no longer peaceful, it was accusatory. The three of them moved through the cavernous rooms like ghosts, unable to look at one another. The first night, the shouting had been epic, a torrent of mutual blame and fury. But now there was only a heavy, suffocating quiet. It was Elara who finally broke it. She stood in the center of the grand living room, her voice, raw and stripped of all its former coldness, echoing in the emptiness. "You did this," she screamed at her parents, the words tearing from her throat. "You and your image, your control. You made me live in this cage. You stole my life twice. First you thought you lost it, and then when you got it back you locked it away." Her tirade wasn't just anger, it was a grief so profound it finally cracked the polished shell of her parents' selfishness. For the first time, they were forced to see not the asset, not the tragic prop, but their daughter, a young woman they had profoundly broken for the sake of their own convenience and greed. They saw the deep, lonely damage their lie had inflicted, and the sight was more horrifying than any financial loss. It was Elara, too, who insisted they find Maya. The old Elara would have wanted her silenced, paid off, disappeared. The new one, shattered but finally honest, knew there was only one path forward. It took some effort, but they discovered she hadn't left the city. She had used her small savings to start her own venture, a modest cleaning service she named Clearview. The irony was not lost on anyone. They found the storefront on a quiet, unassuming street, a world away from their manicured estate. A simple bell chimed as they opened the door. The air smelled of citrus and honesty. Maya looked up from her desk, her expression not one of triumph or gloating, but of calm expectation. Mr. Vance, falling back on the only language he knew, spoke first. He cleared his throat, awkwardly offering an envelope thick with cash. "For your discretion," he said, the word tasting like ash. "And for the inconvenience." Maya looked at the envelope, then back at his face, and slowly shook her head. She did not even reach for it. The refusal was absolute and silent. Then Elara stepped forward. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed, but they were clear and focused directly on Maya. "He's wrong," Elara said, her voice quiet but steady. "This isn't for discretion." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Maya, I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I'm sorry for the lie I made you live inside. You were the only one who was brave enough to actually see me. Thank you." The apology was simple, direct, and devoid of any excuse. It cost her everything to say it, and in doing so, she finally began to reclaim something of herself. Mrs. Vance, humbled beyond words, simply nodded, adding a quiet, "We are so very sorry for our arrogance." Maya accepted their words with a slight nod. The air in the small, clean office seemed to settle. "I didn't do it to ruin you," Maya said. "I did it because the truth has a weight. Your lie was too heavy for me to carry anymore." She looked at Elara, a flicker of something like compassion in her eyes. A clean floor is good, she said, gesturing around her own small, spotless business. But a clean heart is better. I hope you find yours now. The lesson was delivered not with anger, but with a quiet finality. The Vances had nothing left to say. They turned and left the office, the bell chiming softly behind them, the envelope of money still sitting, untouched, on the counter. They were poorer than they had ever been, but for the first time, they were free of the terrible, exhausting work of hiding the truth. Elara did not return to the gilded cage. She used a small, independent portion of her trust fund to start a foundation, a real one, dedicated to supporting domestic abuse survivors, people who felt trapped and unseen. She told her story, her real story, as a warning about the cages people can build with lies, no matter how gilded the bars. And Maya? Her business, Clearview, flourished. People sought her out not just for her cleaning skills, but because they wanted to support a woman of profound integrity. They wanted their homes cleaned by someone who knew that some stains went deeper than the surface, and that the only way to truly clean anything was with honesty. The two women never became friends, their worlds were too different, but they shared a silent understanding. They had both been trapped by the Vance lie, and they had both, in their own ways, fought their way out into the light. If you found yourself captivated by this journey from a world of deceit to a life built on truth, if you were moved by the power of integrity and the courage it takes to face a difficult reality, then consider joining our community of listeners who value stories with a moral heart. By subscribing to the channel, you ensure you don't miss the next narrative we explore, each one crafted to not only entertain but to leave you with something to ponder long after the final word is spoken. Your support helps us continue to bring these tales of humility, discovery, and redemption to life. Subscribe now, and become part of a story-loving community that believes in the power of a clean heart.